Hello, and welcome to this discussion of Eve's Diary by composer Cherise Leiter. I'm Dr. Jennifer Piazza-Pick and am currently Assistant Professor of Music in Voice at Queen's University of Charlotte in North Carolina. I am also one of the founders of Whistling Hens, a chamber ensemble devoted to performing works by women composers. My co-founder, Dr. Natalie Groom, is clarinet professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the manager of Advancement Operations and Analytics at Washington Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. Our name, Whistling Hens, was inspired by a music critic of Lily Boulanger, who said, "Women composers are at best whistling hens." Today, we are happy to be collaborating with composer Cherise Leiter, professor of music at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where she teaches music theory and composition. Cherise has written for choir, piano, opera, voice, carillon, orchestra, and assorted chamber ensembles, and she's been a featured composer at numerous music festivals. We first met her in 2018 at the Mississippi Music by Women Festival, and that summer, our Whistling Hens duo started working with Cherise on a transcription of her American Folk Suite, which was originally written for flute and soprano. She was the first composer to work directly with our ensemble. Soon after we had our transcription in 2019, we commissioned Eve's Diary. Both American Folk Suite and Eve's Diary are on our new album, Reacting to the Landscape, and we are planning a residency with Cherise at Metropolitan State in the spring of 2024. Before we listen to the piece, I'll let Cherise tell you a little bit about the background of Eve's Diary.
Thank you so much. And I had a wonderful experience working with the Whistling Hens on this. When we started talking about this project, I immediately thought of Mark Twain. I've been a fan of Mark Twain since I was a child. The first book I ever read of his was A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. I think I was in late elementary or middle school. My mom was a librarian, so we got dragged to the library a lot. And I really fell in love with his sort of cynicism and humor and just his general voice when he wrote. He wrote the story Eve's Diary shortly after his wife's death. It was written after her death and published in 1905. And it traces the story of creation through Eve's eyes. And at first you might think, if you know anything about Mark Twain, that, it might have been a bit more of a cynical approach to it, or sometimes we get a little suspicious when a man writes from a woman's voice, especially something about the creation story, and the Adam and Eve. But this was just an incredibly funny and touching version of this through Eve's eyes. He had, by all accounts, been deeply, deeply in love with his wife. It's quite an amazing love story if you read about it. And people feel that this was sort of his tribute to her. He also wrote a companion story from the viewpoint of Adam, and that's where you think of the typical Mark Twain. He makes Adam quite similar to some of his other writings. Adam is a bit arrogant, kind of a curmudgeon, not very open-minded sometimes, and so he's the perfect foil to Eve. And you can actually buy a version of the two books that are juxtaposed together, and so you can read the different things that happen from the two viewpoints, one right after the other. I highly recommend it if you can get a hold of that. From the beginning, I really loved Twain's portrayal of Eve. He wrote her to be this amazing combination of innocence, childlike curiosity, sweetness, affection, intelligence, humor, strength. And so when I was thinking about what text to choose for this project, even though I had initially thought I wanted to use a female poet or a female author, I just kept coming back to this. And I talked to both Jen and Natalie about that and had them, I think I sent them a excerpt to read and to see how they felt. And we all decided that this would just be the perfect setting. And so throughout the song that we did and the first day, which is what we set the first day, Saturday. Mark Twain actually goes all the way through the story of creation. from the very beginning to after they get removed from Eden, and then even into, the Cain and Abel story, etc. But we decided that for this, we would just set the first day, which was Saturday. She's just come into her first full day of existence. And she moves from her initial questions as to who she is and how she got there to becoming curious about the world around her, and then beginning to explore the world, and finally running into Adam and turning her energies, her curiosity, to figuring out what he is at first, and then trying to initiate contact, which doesn't go very well since he's kind of frightened of her and keeps climbing trees to get away from her. Throughout the piece, and especially in the opening, the clarinet represents the world around Eve. So I very much conceived of the clarinet and the voice as two distinct personalities. The voice is obviously Eve, right? It's obviously the way she thinks of the world and her actual words. But then I wanted the clarinet to be not just an accompaniment figure. I wanted the clarinet to actually be a character. And so the clarinet is actually the world that Eve comes into existence and is already existed, right? Because if you think about the days of creation, the world is sort of there, and Eve comes into it. And so I wanted to show an excerpt, which is sort of how I conceived of this. So the song opens with just the clarinet by itself. And I'm going to share my screen. And here's the opening to Eve's diary. So you'll notice that the clarinet just opens by itself on a very low pitch. This is the foundation of the world, right? The world coming into existence. Requires lots of breath support on Natalie's side there to get through this, but very simple. And then as the world comes into existence, sort of as the light dawns, it gets more and more active. But you'll notice how long it is before Eve shows up. And so when Eve shows up and says her first words, I feel like an experiment, at this point, the clarinet becomes aware of her and starts to try to encourage her to come out of herself and to explore, tries to give her courage to explore the world around her. And so you'll see that the clarinet plays to her, and then Eve mimics. So I wanted to very much sort of show this almost as, if you've ever been around a small child who is trying to imitate what their parent or the adult is doing, I wanted it to very much feel like this, like the clarinet is encouraging her, and she's getting her courage by imitating and mimicking the clarinet. And so that's how I conceived of the two roles. And then you'll see as Eve gets more and more confident, she starts to sing on her own rather than just speaking, and trying out her voice, and not being afraid of how good it sounds or how bad it sounds, just getting used to that. And so that's sort of how I conceived of the two roles right from the beginning. I wanted them to be a very definite dichotomy between the two. As we go through the piece, the complexity increases, and so you'll notice as you hear this that we go from very free, no meter, very open. As we get further through the piece, things become more metrical. There becomes a greater sense of a definition of beat, although the meter does change a bit. But then as we get closer to the sort of I guess you would say maybe the climax of the song, where Eve finds Adam, the meter actually is intentionally more complex. And so I actually alternate measures of 7/8 and 4/4. And the 7/8 is actually representing the Adam, who isn't as kind of strong and defined as Eve is at this point. When you read the book, he's not as curious about what's around him. And the 4/4, which is Eve just being very sure of herself and who she is and what she's trying to do. Throughout the piece, I also incorporated speaking parts, actually for both the singer and the clarinetist, who has to speak with the singer sometimes as well, with the voice as well. And that's because I have found, and this is something I've done in several pieces, I've found that adding speaking into an art song is an effective way to add some timbral interest, and also to place an emphasis on text that I felt was important in some way. So, for instance, one of my favorite lines in this section in Saturday is, quote, "Eternal vigilance is the price of supremacy." That to me is just such an interesting thing. And when spoken by Eve, who has just sprung into existence and isn't even a day old yet, it seems both somehow comical and also profound when you think about what it means. Eternal vigilance is the price of supremacy. So I actually have both the clarinet and the voice speak it together to really bring it across. And then there's other places where either the singer is speaking. For instance, I think it is a man is spoken. I don't want that to be lost through the music or have it not be understood. And then there's a number of other places where they speak something for emphasis. I also asked the singer and the clarinetist to do a small amount of acting, nothing too grand, but again, just to bring across the intention of the text and to add some interest. This is an extended art song. It's over 10 minutes long. And even though it's highly sectionalized, I was consciously looking for ways to keep the audience engaged in Eve's journey and to delineate the character of both performers. And I felt that the singing and the acting, the little amount of acting and staging, really contributed to that. I will admit that at first, the thought of composing an art song without piano took some getting used to. As composers, we are very much ingrained in thinking that voice must be paired with piano, right? It must be, or at least multiple instruments, that there has to be something that provides harmonic support. But I feel that having two distinctly melodic instruments really opened up the possibilities for this piece. Beyond what a voice and piano would be. It became very easy to portray both as distinct characters. I think sometimes as a composer, no matter how hard you try, when a song is scored for the traditional singer and piano, the piano always seems to play a subservient role. It doesn't matter how elaborate you get. The second we hear a voice with text, that's where our focus goes. But I felt like with two melodic instruments, they really were both on a level playing field from the very beginning. I think it does present some challenges for the singer. Without the harmonic support of a piano, finding pitches when first learning the piece might be more difficult. But I consciously was very careful with the notes I chose for the clarinet to play, especially in sections where the voice then later has to enter somewhat exposed. I wanted to make sure the singer never felt like they were trying to just magically find a note out of the air. You know, this piece definitely requires quite a bit of ear training kind of practice. And at the same time, as a composer, I didn't want to make it just something that was such a challenge that it wasn't an enjoyable experience. I never doubted the ability of a singer to be able to do it, but I wanted them to also enjoy the process of performing this piece and learning this piece. I love the pairing of the voice and clarinet for the setting of the text. I think at some point it might be fun to explore the rest of the work beyond just the first day. And I have flirted with the idea of increasing the instrumentation. Oddly enough, not necessarily adding piano at this point, but I wonder about maybe a woodwind quintet with a little bit of percussion supporting, Eve. Who knows? But I feel that the setting of this first day, Saturday, is just perfectly presented with the voice and the clarinet. I hope you enjoy it.
So let's see what happens as we become part of Eve's world. This is Eve's Diary by Cherise Leiter. experiment. Eternal vigilance is the price of supremacy. I am almost a whole day old now. I arrived yesterday as it seems to me, and it
before yesterday. I was not there when it happened. It could be, of course, that it did happen and that I was not noticing. Very well, I will be watchful now, and if any day before yesterday's happened, I will make note of it. Some instinct tells me that these details will be important to the historian someday. Everything looks better today than yesterday. In the rush of finishing up, the mountains were left in a ragged condition, and some of the plains were cluttered with rubbish. Noble and beautiful works of art should not be subjected to haste. And this majestic new world is indeed a most noble and beautiful work. I followed the other experiment around yesterday at a distance to see what it might be for if I could. I think it is a man. I think it is a man. A man! I have never seen a man, but it looks like one. I feel sure that that is what it is. I feel more curiosity about it than any of the other reptiles, if it is a reptile. And I suppose it is. For it has frowsy hair and blue eyes and looks like a reptile. So I think it is a reptile. Though it may be architecture. I was afraid of it at first and started to run every time it turned around. But by and by I found it was only trying to get away. So after that I tracked it along several hours, which made it nervous and unhappy. At last it was a good deal worried and climbed a tree. I waited a good while, then gave it up and went home. Today the same thing over. I've got it up a tree again.
I just love this piece so much, and that incorporates a lot of cute moments and humor. Even now, it still feels really fresh to us. And I think my favorite part is when Jen exclaims, "I think it is a man." Even in performance, I mean, she's so funny, and it makes me laugh every time. Something I'd add to what Cherise was saying earlier is that, as this piece progressive and it gets more active, so too does the amount of interplay and coordination between the clarinet and soprano. And so in the opening, where the clarinet is firmly representing the entire world, those expansive long tones make me think of the world rotating on its axis. And I wonder if you all know, do you know the opening spinning logo for the Universal movies, where it's the globe and then Universal slowly comes around? You know, that expansiveness, that's what it makes me think of. So in the opening, the world and Eve are separate and they're unfamiliar to each other. But as they're going along and they literally start playing together more, they kind of find their groove and they become friends. Eve is more part of the world and the world is embracing her. They're melding into each other and collaborating fluidly. And, you know, kind of coming back to the theme of this session and the abstract that you saw, this is kind of cheesy, but I also see it as a metaphor for what we as Whistling Hens are doing in our work, performing and commissioning women composers. Only a few years ago, Cherise was a stranger. We were unfamiliar to each other. We started exploring a whole new world of a collaborative relationship, baby stepping together. We started with just that transcription of American Folk Suite. And then we really started vibing with each other and we experienced mutual inspiration from each other. We finally grew this collaboration into a new piece, which is about the beginning of Eve. And, you know, separate from this, we're also really excited for what we're collaborating on in 2024. We're giving a residency with Cherise at her school, for which she's writing yet another piece for us. And we're going to be able to do an entire program together of all Cherise's music. You know, so obligatory plug here and side note, subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on socials so that you can stay in the coop on everything that we're doing. It's some really exciting stuff. But I say all that to say, this is also how we can approach finding and developing new collaborations, which is what I encourage all of you to do. One of my absolute favorite things is getting a random idea or stroke of inspiration that I'm excited about. And then inevitably, there's also a person, a composer, a performer who also comes to mind immediately as a great partner for that idea. And if you've been at this festival for a few years, you may have actually seen lecture recitals that Whistling Hens has done with other composers. So we did one with Jennifer Stevenson and Ashley Day. And this is a real testament to how these seeds of relationships, they blossom into something big and beautiful, maybe even unruly and fabulous, like a wisteria, you know, as we keep going and doing more. And in this call to action to you all of collaborating more with living composers, I wanted to pose some questions to my panel mates for us to discuss, and I hope you'll also engage with us too in the chat and even beyond this session. In this theme of a whole new world, when we're dreaming up a more inclusive vocal world, what does it look like to meet, to collaborate with, and to commission a living composer? I would imagine many of you here in the virtual audience today have been thinking about starting a collaboration and wonder, you know, where do I even begin? So then related to that question are, what are some of the benefits you see in collaborating with living composers? I'll kick us off by saying, I think conferences like this are a great place to start. You know, you get to meet other performers, yes, but you also can meet other composers. You can research the composers behind the music that you're seeing. And I'll maybe pose a question next to Jennifer of like, what are some other things that you think make it easier to meet and collaborate with living composers?
Thank you, Natalie. First, aside from conferences, which I think are a great place to meet other composers, check out who might be winning awards. So for instance, who were the winners and the finalists and even the entrants for the Nats Art Song Award, for the awards through the International Alliance of Women in Music, through Sparks and Wiry Cries, Loon Art. Check out who those composers are, listen to the music, see if you find somebody's writing or somebody's text setting that really speaks to you. There are organizations that sometimes hold online mixer events like the Boulanger Initiative in Washington, D.C., being members of societies, obviously NATS, and Chamber Music America, International Clarinet Association, since I have my clarinetist with me today, and the American Composers Forum are other places where you can really be looking for composers and listening to their music. And we have both found, Natalie and I, that when we find composers that we are interested in, we often just send an email or a message through social media. And Cherise, I wanted to ask you, what do you think about that when performers just reach out to you?
Oh, I do a happy dance. I mean, you know, I'll be reading the email and just sort of squirming around in my seat because somebody heard my music and appreciated it and reached out. I think from the standpoint of a composer, hearing from performers that are interested in your works, or even just reaching out and saying, I heard this, I love it, I know it's not for my instrument, do you have anything for my instrument? You know, from the standpoint of a composer, those are gold. I save every single one of those emails, you know, so when I'm having self-doubt, I can go back and read. But I would say to performers, don't ever be afraid to reach out to a composer. If you see their name in a program, or if you hear their name on a radio or a playlist, because they want to hear from you. And, you know, are they going to rush right out to write something immediately for you? Who knows? It completely depends on where they are, what projects they have. But I think it would be highly unusual for a composer to ever sort of indicate that they don't want to hear from you, or are interested in your thoughts about something. So I would say never be afraid to reach out and make contact with that composer.
Right. And once you're making contact, I mean, Cherise, what are your thoughts and feelings about getting to collaborate with performers who are ending up working on your music?
I love it. I absolutely love working with performers. And now I'll admit, I let the performers take the lead in what that is, because some performers want a lot of interaction with the composer, some don't. And so I do very much kind of let the performers sort of determine how much interaction they want with me. But if they are interested in interacting with me on a pretty continuous scale, I love that, because from the standpoint of a composer, that means I can get immediate feedback on something. So if I write something and I'm not sure if it's going to work, or if I'm worried about, is it too fast, is it too high, is it too slow, the luxury of being able to reach out immediately and just send an email and a sample of what I'm looking at to the performers and get feedback right away, that's incredibly useful. And I think it also allows me to actually be a bit more experimental, or a bit more courageous in some of the things I might try, because I can tell immediately if I'm going too far or need to be dialed back. You know, if I'm sort of just writing a piece for a nebulous group and it eventually gets sent out and performed, it might be a couple of years before I find out that something didn't work. And so the ability to be able to reach out and talk to the performers and go, hey, what do you think about this? You know, it saves so much time and anguish later. So.
Yeah. And, you know, from the performer standpoint too, even before I was part of Whistling Hens, I was part of several wind quintets and other instrumental chamber groups. And so had some experience with commissioning and working with living composers, and, you know, sort of hashing out some details of what contracts could look like. I know in talking to Jen, that was more of a new thing. First of all, the chamber music setting, but also, you know, deciding what will be in the contract for something like this, these art songs that are for clarinet and soprano. And so, Jen, I wondered if you want to talk about some of the things that maybe appear in contracts that we've explored and thought about, and what that kind of looks like.
You know, it's such a funny thing, because wind quintets and brass quintets, when they start, they tend to draw up formal contracts about a lot of things about their ensemble. But I'm not sure that we do that as singers. You know, when you work with a pianist, you're just like, great, let's work together. And maybe you have a contract through the venue, but you don't have a contract between you and the pianist. So much less when you are working with a living composer, you want to make sure you have a contract. So some of the things we've had in our contracts as we've been commissioning are deadlines for when the text or the topic of the text is going to be decided, when a first and final draft might be due, what exactly is in the final deliverable. So soprano on top, other instrument on the bottom. Working with a B-flat clarinetist, I have to say, we have to tell composers to please also make me a C score, because otherwise I got to transpose the B-flat clarinet and then figure out where how my pitches relate. So having that, and sometimes Natalie needs a separate clarinet score because there's so many page turns and her hands are kind of busy. Also making sure we're specific about what type of instrument, so B-flat versus E-flat clarinets, dates by which we will have the first performance, And honestly, starting out, you might not have a lot of money. So what we've also offered, in addition to financial packages, when we haven't been able to maybe offer a strong financial package, is also offering a certain number of performances, and also offering in return a high quality recording of the work. So this gives the composer the ability to apply to conferences like this. It also gives them the ability to have a high quality recording for applications for scholarships and grants. So we like to be able to offer those things as well to our composers.
And I mean, I'm biased here as an intruder in this vocal art song world, this clarinetist joining your festival. But something that we talk about and think about a lot is, what are the opportunities out there? Like, what can we identify to provide a fresh take on art songs so that we can continue exploring this world of this additional collaboration of adding other musical instruments to this. It doesn't have to be clarinet, obviously, but of course I will do it with you if you all want to collaborate. But how do we define art song versus vocal chamber music? How do we blur that line? What kinds of opportunities are there to collaborate with non-pianists? And I know, Cherise, you were mentioning something earlier about some of the Nats art song guidelines, and I wondered if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Sure. The NATS organization, National Association of Teachers of Singing, has a art song competition that they do. I believe it's every 2 years. I don't think it's every year. I think it's every 2 years. And they, in the call for this year, opened it up to voice and one other instrument. So that instrument could be piano, but it also could be flute, violin, clarinet, etc. And so I think there is a movement out there to sort of think more inclusively when it comes to art song about what exactly is an art song. And I know, again, it takes a bit of adjustment, speaking as a composer, to think about writing for voice without sort of the I guess I'll call it maybe safe presence of a piano, just because you know what a piano can provide in terms of harmonic content. And this is in no way to denigrate a piano as a companion instrument to anything. That is my primary instrument, and I love it dearly. But just, creating an interesting body of diverse literature would include pairing the voice with other instruments as well, and other instruments without the piano. And so I think that's a really positive move towards sort of codifying what an art song is when designated art song competitions actually open up the instrumentation to more than just voice and piano.
And I'd like to throw in here too that as a person who has been trained as a singer, right, we are almost exclusively always with pianists. And if we add in an instrument, the piano is still there. And I don't know that we have a lot of opportunity for pairing with other instruments in our studies outside of piano. And part of the reason is likely the harmonic foundation, right? Because we need, especially finding our pitches, we need that harmonic foundation. But working with just another melodic instrument as more of a duet, it's a really different musical skill. And I think it's something that we should maybe start thinking about fostering in our early stage singers as well, giving them the opportunity to figure out how to do this, because the musicality that is given to us, the musicianship levels that this takes, really ups your game. So I do hope that people as teachers of singing that might be here today also maybe start considering how your art songs for your students might include something that doesn't have piano, to get their ear sort of working in a different way. Leading into that, I also want to maybe pose that as we're thinking about the future of art song, how we also might collaborate with other artists outside of our discipline. Natalie and I have both done a good bit of that. In my work at Queen's, everything is very cross-departmental. We like to mix and match, but even in other places, I've worked together with ballet dancers individually, as well as with ballet companies, where they've staged a ballet to our quartet singing the Dvorak Zigeuner Lieder. And so there are ways to incorporate that. And of course, many baritones out there may have done some Schubert song cycles with artwork. And I think we can take things even farther than that. And I know Natalie has done some of her own work with clarinet and dancer.
Yeah. Well, and even like more broadly, just theatrical elements. As an instrumentalist, I'm very much like, no, I'm not an actor. I do not do that thing. But, you know, a composer like Cherise definitely pushes me out of my comfort zone a little bit, you know, to speak while performing, to do a little bit of acting. So it's great toe in the water. But yeah, to Jen's point, I have done some collaborations with a dear friend who worked in contemporary dance, and we did something called Optical Chicken, where I wore a chicken suit onesie and I played weird notes on the clarinet and made metronome sounds and little toy piano things. That was a lot of fun, pushed me out of my comfort zone. And I'm working on a project right now that's for clarinet and narrator, where all the text is created by a speech language pathologist so that it can be used for children who are in speech therapy as a learning tool. I'm also thinking about one of our recent conferences that we went to, which was the National Women's Theater Festival, which was kind enough to invite us non-theater people to their festival to talk about one of our pieces that had more acting and narration. And I would love to see more of that in our creative spaces of like, how can we blur the lines again between other disciplines and encourage more cross-departmental collaborations. I mean, obviously for singers, you all are collaborating with poets or finding text by poets, but even beyond that, you know, what can we do? And I imagine, Jen, you have thoughts on working with poets and other literary things.
Well, you and I have actually been very fortunate with some of the collaborations we've had to also have living poets as part of the collaboration. And I've found that to be exceptionally interesting. And it was actually really enlightening to see that although we say the poetry is really important and the poet's really important, we actually often don't invite the poets into our performance spaces. So we do, I think there's a little call there that maybe we are ignoring our poets, even though we'd like to claim we are not. These are a lot of really big topics. And I think this is a longer term discussion amongst all of us. So all three of us today hope that you'll continue this discussion with us and with others outside of this pre-recorded lecture, because honestly, we love nothing more than talking about what we do and helping others also find their own musical fulfillment. You can learn more about Cherise Leiter's music at cheriseleiter.com. And you can find us as Whistling Hens and as Natalie Groom or Jennifer Piazza-Pick on all of the main socials. If you head over to whistlinghens.com or our Whistling Hens Linktree account, you can connect with us there. So if we can introduce you to some cool composers, or you have questions about writing grants for commissions, if you are a singer who wants to work with some non-pianists, and how can we help you do that? And if you're looking for duo rep, because we do have a database that we've been compiling with some duo rep, truly anything that might come to your mind, feel free to send any of us a note. We love meeting people through conferences, and especially when people want to set up a virtual happy hour, we are usually all in on that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great time at this wonderful festival.